Well, welcome. As always, we'll begin just with a brief scripture reference, one that relates to children and young people, and a moment of prayer, and then we can start. This afternoon I've chosen Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4 to 9. Hang on, I see a wee message there from Fiona. I'll just respond to that on chat. Hi, Fiona. If I send you a wee prompt and ask you to unmute, see if that triggers anything for you. Okay, you're unmuted now. Can you hear us yet? Okay, we'll hold on a moment while you log off and try again. It's great how this technology makes things so much easier. I have this theory that when you see www in an internet address, it means while we wait. Oh, and here's Cara coming in. Hi, Cara. We're just waiting for Fiona. She's had some difficulty getting sound and vision, so we'll hold on for a moment. That's okay, Cara, no problem. I feel like I'm always starting with apologies here, but again, apologies from university. Is anybody yet on Aula?
Managed to enroll, so I've had some success.
Good.
But no, the Aula was just blank. It said that like I needed to be added to some spaces. I can't remember exactly what it said.
Right.
I don't know what that means.
Okay, I'll take a note of that and follow that up for you. You should already be on it as a member of the class.
Okay. I think Lee had the same thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I'm sorry, wait for Ian to mute. We're in the same room, so it's we need to make sure we're both muted if each other speak. Yeah, just the same issue as Ian. Managed to enroll, but I did get an email from is it Ellie?
Yep.
She seems to be on it because she'd already been on 2 hours later, and she thought I wasn't. She's emailed me to check out where the process is, so we're in communication about sorting that out. So I think, you know, I'd imagine she'd get us sorted in the next day or two.
That's good. I can check on that with Ellie.
Yeah.
I think we need to make a start, and hopefully Fiona will be able to join us. As I was explaining, Christina won't be able to join us as she's currently on her way to Stornoway. Hi, Fiona. Perfect timing. We're just about to start. Hi, Fiona. We can see you. You're muted at the moment. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Hooray!
Hooray. Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll make a start. I'm just going to begin by reading a section from Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you know your Judaism, it's a familiar section of scripture. It's well known as the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel. But it mentions children in particular, children and young people. So Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. If you know a Jewish neighborhood at all, you can always identify Orthodox homes by a small mezuzah, a little box fixed to the gatepost. Inside that mezuzah, there's a tiny scroll with a copy of 4 particular sections from Scripture. And one of them is this one, Deuteronomy. Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What fascinates me about it and why I'm sharing it today is that it immediately focuses on children and young people. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with heart and soul, mind and strength. And then straight away, let your kids know this too. It's not just in the family context, it's about the whole community, ensuring that the next generation shares the same faith. Let's keep that thought in mind as we bow for a moment in prayer. Father God, we come together as those who share a faith understanding. We've each made a commitment to serve and follow you, to put you first, to listen to you, to serve you heart and soul, mind and strength. We recognize in this portion of Scripture a calling upon us, a command to us to pass on this faith, this experience that we've had, to share it with our children, with our young people, in the home, on the streets, wherever we go. It should be seen about us that we love the Lord. Help us, Lord, to be as effective as we can be in sharing our faith. Help us to be shining examples of faith. In your name we pray. Amen. A quick check. I did send to you, hopefully you've all had an email, which had a PowerPoint for today. Good. And a copy of the template. We'll be having a look at that template. That's one of the key documents for us to use within the school context. So hopefully you've got all that. And what I'll do is I will bring up that PowerPoint so that we've got that for reference. Okay, it's on my screen and it helpfully says that you can now see that. Is that the case? That's good. Time for reflection. A picture from a rainy day. Let's plough straight into it. The time for reflection template. Fiona, as somebody who works in a school, who's a teacher, you understand evidence for HMIE and so on, and lesson plans, all this kind of stuff. Apologies then, and forgive me if it sounds like I'm just loading another one on you. But it's a useful framework. Hopefully you all know how to use a template. It's really simple. It's one of the benefits of Word templates is once you start filling it in, you can save that as a copy document. You can add to it, you can delete it. And this one is a good way just to provide that evidence for schools of what you're doing. You would fill out this template for an assembly. You would fill it out if you were taking part in an RME class. If you were doing a time for reflection event for the school, like prayer spaces in schools, you would fill this out as well. Which reminds me, actually, I will be able to put, there are on Aula lots of examples of completed templates. But I just want to float a wee idea past you. I've printed lots of stuff. I've created little books of time for reflection events and so on. And I would love to give you 3 copies. If that's something you would be interested in, would you email me your address and postcode? And what I will do is I will send you copies of some of these booklets so you can see what a TfR template looks like in practice. There's about 4 or 5 booklets I can send you, and it's got loads of assembly examples for primary school, secondary school, special needs. I can send you too a little memory disk with loads of resources on it. All free to you. All you have to do is surrender your address. And I promise not to use it for marketing, etc., etc. It would just be so I could send you a wee package of free material. So as I say, if you're interested in that, just drop me a wee email with your home address. Okay, into the template. Once you get that package, you'll see what it actually looks like. But the template saves you doing an awful lot of work. So instead of having to generate a paper copy of a form for every event you do in school, it's all there on the template already. So here's the opening page of it. You can see it simply says the date and rationale of the TfR event, briefly state when and why the event is being held. And the template allows you just to delete that little descriptor there and to type in something as simple as Easter service. Specify which school you're in. So I might put Auchenwraith Primary School, Easter service, and the date. The second bit, I find it helpful to give it a title. So Easter is kind of description, that's generic, but maybe you want to focus on the fact of the resurrection or the witness of the soldier, something like that. So just give it a title that helps you to remember it. The third box, again, it's just all you're doing there is age and stage. So if this is, say, a primary school thing, you might put down this is an assembly for P1 to 7. If you're in a secondary school, you might put down this is an S3 assembly. Or if you're working in a classroom, it might be that it's an RME class, and that's where you're putting down the details of what age group it is. Next box allows you to specify the aim. How does this event promote the spiritual development of all members of the school community? And that's a direct quote from the RORG, the report of the Religious Observance Review Group. And that document says essentially what it is you're aiming to do when you take an assembly or you do a time for reflection event. You're promoting spiritual development. It's worth just putting down how. How do I see this event doing that? And which of the school's shared values does it express and celebrate? Put it this way, if you aim at nothing specific, you'll hit it every time. But if you know what you're aiming at, then you can assess how well you're doing. You can get feedback. You can demonstrate where you're fitting into curriculum and so on. And that's what the next few sections talk about. Where does your event fit? So you'll see the next bit on the template is what's called the sensings. And again, this is from the key document, the report of the Religious Observance Review Group. It suggested that when you're doing any time for reflection event, assemblies, RME input and so on, what you're trying to target are these 6 sensings. And what I've done is I've put on the template the straightforward text from that document. And that means what you can do is you can delete the bits that don't apply to your event, and you can keep the bits that do apply. Now, you have to be realistic. When you're doing an assembly, you might have in mind, for example, you want children to experience a moment of awe and wonder and mystery about the natural world. So you might have, say, a picture of the solar system, macroscopic. You might have a picture down a microscope, a microscopic picture, and just see the complexity and wonder of it. Maybe your event is aimed at just creating that moment where kids go, wow. Now, be realistic. If that's your goal, delete everything else. Nobody's going to be impressed if you say, my event will help pupils to sense mystery, sense value, sense meaningfulness, etc., etc. There is no event that is going to touch all 6 of these. But being clear on what you're aiming at, I think, is really important. So, for example, if you're coming in as a person of faith, a partner with a school to talk about issues of poverty and how a food bank and a local community can help, that might lead on to sensing challenge. How does a pupil deal with injustice? So keep the focus sharp. The point of this box is gives you a clear understanding of what you're aiming at. Following on from that, there's a big chunk, a big section, which is the Curriculum for Excellence links. And that's the 4 capacities, the successful learners and so on. And again, it's a case of being selective, very deliberate, choosing exactly what you're targeting. Your next box is which of the 4 key values is your event targeting and why. For some schools, that's going to be an easy one to answer. For example, I'm working with a local secondary school just now. They're doing a relaunch of the Rights Respecting Award. So they've got a focus on wisdom, justice, compassion, and integrity. And they're looking at how to break that down for each year group. And they're doing a target. So 1 month it's going to be wisdom, the next justice, and so on. So what are the key values? There's another huge chunk on health and well-being responsibilities. And when you have a close look at this, you'll see that what I've done is I've copied over the text from the all experiences and outcomes, from the building the curriculum documents and so on. And again, it's a case of read through that and delete everything that doesn't apply. This might seem tedious, but this is gold dust for schools. When the inspectors come in, it shows that you're aware of the language, that you know exactly where you fit, and you've got a very clear understanding of what you're doing in partnership with the school. The way inspectors work is there's always an inspector who looks at the partnership, who looks at how chaplains are engaging, who looks at how the school is engaging with parents and so on. That's part of the assessment. So I've certainly found over the years to be able to hand over a dossier with all these forms in is just wonderful. Shanari indicators, there's a section on that as well. And again, be honest, you won't ever produce an event that hits all 8 indicators. But maybe you'll have specifically in mind an event that contributes to pupils feeling safe. So delete the other 7, highlight that one. It sounds like a lot to do, but once you've done it a couple of times, you see actually it's more about what you choose to take out and what you leave. And the idea is it's creating for you a really sharp focus on what you're doing. This is the classic picture of the Shinari indicators, just in case you don't know what that is. You'll probably see it in all sorts of places around a school. And if a teacher can't get to sleep, there's your mantra. You just keep reciting the Shinari indicators, and off you go. But it's safe, healthy, achieving, nurtured, active, respected, responsible, included. So it's simply taking the first letters of those 8 indicators and applying them. Now, that's health and well-being in schools, but actually, a wee challenge for you is take that and measure your Sunday club against it, or your youth work. Apply it there too. It certainly gives you pause for thought. And it's not Japanese. Somebody once asked me, is this Japanese? It sounds like it, Shinari, but it's not. It's simply an acronym. Now, having done all that, you're actually just at the beginning point, because this is where you begin to describe your actual event and what it is you're doing in, let's say, an assembly, just for ease of understanding it. Let's think of an assembly context. This is the point where you start describing your actual event. Is this time for reflection part of a series? Well, in the secondary school, I would answer yes at the moment. It's part of their series on relaunch of rights respecting. The goals for your event. So make a simple statement. At the end of this event, pupils will be able to do what? To know what? To understand what? What I'm trying to get at here is that when you do an assembly, sometimes there's a temptation for us simply to entertain. Or we're placeholders, babysitters. There can be all sorts of reasons for doing an assembly. If it's truly a time for reflection event, we want to be able to say what our clear goals are and what we want the kids to come away with. You can go on then to your introduction. Who's introducing this event? How is the theme being introduced? How will you gain attention? There's lots of different ways to get folks' attention. It could be a picture you could put up. It could be a piece of music. It could be a drama or a skit or a statement that you make. This is about being intentional and thoughtful on how you do your assemblies. What's the introduction? What's the stimulus, the main stimulus? And I always say to folks, if particularly these days when you're in a secondary school and you've got the all singing, all dancing, you've got the sound system, you've got the vision, you've got everything there. It's worth always having a backup. What will you do if the power goes off? It's happened to me where you're taking an assembly in a secondary school, you've got 400 pupils sitting there, and just as you stand up to speak, the school loses all power. It's an exciting moment, but if your event depended completely on all the electronic stuff, what do you do? So a plan B, always have a plan B. What's your backup for a power cut? What's your backup if the sound system goes off and they can't find the tech? Guided reflection. Now, this for me, I think, is the key point. This is the bit where you're thinking, what do I want pupils to actually do? What do I want the young people to actually feel? How do I want them to respond? It's not a case of telling them what to think. It's about being clear in your own mind. What's the reaction you're looking for? What's the sensing you're trying to create? And then the last bit is about responses. How will you know you've actually done it? How can you figure out evaluation, feedback, and so on? I'm going to stop the screen share just at that point because, again, I'm conscious I've thrown a lot at you there. I hope you've had a wee chance already to open up that template and have a look at it, and it will then make much more sense. But any reactions and comments? Any thoughts? Any questions?
One thing I was just wondering when you were going through, because like I had a look through it, and like there's a lot of bits that you can put in.
Yeah.
And just like, is there always going to be something in each of those boxes? Like when you're covering like the org and the curriculum for excellence and the Shinani bit, like are you always going to have something in every space?
Virtually always you will have something. It may simply be one word. That the key value was, say, compassion.
Okay.
As I say, it looks daunting at first sight, but it is more about a case of what you sweep out.
Okay.
And if all you're left is a word or a sentence in each box, that's fine. And there may, I suppose, there may occasionally be a point where you don't see what to go in the box. But generally, I find there's something in every box.
I was going to say, I think using something like this once practiced will ease the construction of preparing something. I think, you know, it gives a clear structure to how you can go about preparing something for a school.
Yes, thank you for that, Fiona. That's one of the benefits I've found, is that it makes me far sharper in my preparation as well. It's not just a case of you're doing a tick box exercise and you're providing the evidence for the school to use. It also begins to affect your practice. So you're much more sharply focused when you're planning events. Craig, have you got a point there? You're unmuted.
No, sorry.
No?
I didn't know I was unmuted.
No, I thought you were just about to ask a question.
No.
You mentioned,
carry on.
Oh, sorry, Steve. Slightly different question, but you mentioned in there that this is really helpful to give to the lead for TfR or RO, whatever, for the benefit of inspectors. Has inspectors ever spoken to you as a chaplain? Have they ever interviewed you as part of their inspection of the school, or do they use what the teachers say in the main?
No, frequently when the inspectors are in, I've also been asked to come in and meet with them.
Okay.
You tend to get classed as chaplain alongside the parent representatives and so on. If you're there in a semi-formal role with the school, say you're taken on as a youth worker or you're part of the guidance system, you'll definitely be asked. You'll be included.
Okay.
But yes.
That's good to know. The other thing I wanted to ask, sorry, was that it's similar to Ian's question, but it's almost like split into two halves, isn't it? So you've got the first half is around, you know, what are you, what targets is this meeting within the various things? And some of them were just, you could delete the ones that weren't relevant. Is it a sense that you can just delete that, or do you need to also add in a little explanation of how you're going to meet that challenge, or meet that mark or whatever?
That's a good way to look at it. Thanks, Lee. Over that first half, you're essentially deleting all the bits that don't apply. So there's very little that you would actually need to add in there.
Okay.
What you're doing is you're demonstrating that your event fits the ethos of school, it fits the documents for school, it fits the guidelines.
Okay.
So in that first half, there's really nothing you're writing in. It's in the second half where you begin to describe your actual event. That's where you'll begin to type stuff in.
Okay. So that's helpful, because I would have naturally, I think I would have, say the sentence, I would have, say I was wanting to look at challenge, sense and challenge. I might have deleted the rest of them, but said, I plan to meet sense and challenge by doing this. but I don't actually need to do that. I just need to say, this is challenge, and then that'll come through in the second half.
That's why I've set it up as a template,
Yeah.
so that you don't have to, every time you do an event, write in the same sentence, I am
Yeah.
aiming to meet compassion or whatever.
Yeah.
You can just delete everything else, and that's the one word focus.
Oh, that's good.
So as I say, it seems clumsy, it seems a lot at first. It's something you get much quicker at as you go on, and it saves you duplicating stuff every time you do an event. Now, this is the actual form that you'll use when you do a classroom presentation for us. So that was, remember, that was our second assessment piece, is you'll each have a chance to present to the class a time for reflection event. Not looking for a big scale thing, just a 5 to 10 minute thing, like you might do for an assembly. But what I want you to do is use the template for it. So that's to give you a chance to use it. Which is a good point to see if anybody wants to jump in and book a date. I've got a little list here. So you've got plenty of lead-in time. The first date I've jotted down is the 26th of October. So from that week onwards, we can take one of you each week. So just to throw out the dates, 26th October, 2nd, 9th, 16th, 23rd and 30th of November. Now, I know, Fiona, you've already indicated that you wouldn't be available on the 23rd November. So if I give you first option, do you want to pick one of the other dates? You're muted at the moment.
Could I have the week before the 23rd? I'm just trying to find that in the diary.
Yeah, that would be the 16th.
Oh, 16th. Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. Right, anybody else want to pick a date there?
I'll go 9th November then, if that's okay.
All right, thank you, Lee.
Could I get one of the other ones in November? I've got a big event, a new group starting on the, like that week, the 25th, off the week before. So the 26th would be very tight for me to be able to prepare for. But any other ones, like the 2nd or the 16th or the 10th, would all be fine.
Okay, if I put you down for the second
Yeah.
November. Okay. And Carla, I see the wee note in chat from you. So Carla, would you like the 23rd or the 30th of November? You can just put a wee response in the chat. 23rd. Okay, thank you. Craig, that leaves you a choice of the 26th or the 30th, and poor Christina will just have to take what's left.
Probably 30th for me. 30th
Okay.
for
Yep.
November.
Okay. We'll put down the 26th of October as the one for Christina. If for any reason it turns out you're not able to do something on the chosen date, then we can always double up the next week. But that gives us plenty of time to do this exercise properly, and it gives you time to prepare for it. So thank you, everybody. And as I say, the other thing, just to remind you about, please send me your address if you want a free package of exemplar material that you can use. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Or are you happy to carry on? Okay, we'll come back to the sharing the screen. Got so many windows open here. Can I find it again? There we go. Okay, having looked at the template itself, can I go on to give you some top tips on preparing stuff for using in schools? And again, this is not just about in schools. I think this is any time you're working with children and young people, whatever the context, youth group, Sunday school, or whatever. But some comments that I've learned, some guidance that I've picked up over the years. Most schools these days are inclusive. I spent 16 years in a special needs school, one of the biggest in Scotland. It was covering South Lanarkshire and beyond. And at its height, it had 250 pupils of all ages. And the special needs covered everything from behavioural issues to disability issues. And then education policy and philosophy changes, and all that specialism that was built up in the special needs units was dispersed. And the idea was that pupils would be placed in mainstream schools with support. The phrase "I right" kind of comes to mind on that one. It's had mixed success, but most schools these days will have special needs units or a special focus. They might have an ADHD unit attached, an autistic spectrum unit attached. They might have a learning support wing. And the idea is to integrate pupils. Typically these days in primary schools across Scotland, you're asked to give attention to BSL, to signing, to Makaton as well, all these kind of things. And schools are making a good effort to be inclusive. Don't resent that. Don't think it's another burden. It is about improving our communication with all kids. It's about getting it right for every child. So one of the schools I work in has the council's deaf unit. And that means that virtually every assembly, I can guarantee when we're in there or we're in an RME class, there'll be somebody with a cochlear implant and you need to wear the special microphone for that, or there'll be a couple of pupils who are having BSL signed for them. Now, what I try and do, I think, recommend this to you as good practice, is assume that that's going to be the case. That when you're in the school, you're going to have pupils of all abilities and all sorts of a range of experiences. So I always give as full a script as I can to the translators for the deaf, and I do that 24 hours before an event. I understand perfectly well when you're doing an event in school, you end up ad-libbing, you react to what's going on. But it's really helpful for the interpreters if you can give a full script in advance. It means they can check over things like vocabulary. Sometimes it takes a while if they have to spell out, fingerspell a particular word. So if they know your vocabulary, if they know the rough sequence of what you're planning to do, really makes it helpful for the translators for the deaf. If you can learn a little bit of sign language yourself, that's a huge advantage. And it's really become something that I do quite a lot in primary schools in particular. I'll say to the kids, we're going to take a moment to pray. Do you want an eyes open prayer? And we can all do sign language for it. Or do you want an eyes closed prayer and I'll do it? And invariably the kids choose, let's do one that we can participate in. We'll all do the signs together. There's a top tip. Pass on a full script in advance. Really gets you focused on what you're doing. I think another thing is when you're handing over that, or you're thinking about your own event, always calculate the smog index. You heard of the smog index, the smog test? SMOG stands for the Standard Measure of Gobbledygook. It's an actual test. Whoever came up with it, I think, had a sense of humour. You can find out, there's loads of versions online. If you just Google smog test, smog index, it's actually an incredibly useful tool. The smog test is the standard measure of gobbledygook. And what you do is you take the text of your assembly and you count in it how many polysyllabic words you have. Take a sample of 30 sentences. How many words of 3 syllables or more have you actually got in that text? Those who are theologically trained are really guilty of this. We tend to use big theological words, but count how many polysyllabic words you've got. Take the square root of the nearest perfect square of that number and add 3. Sounds complicated, but what you'll end up with is a rough figure for comprehension. I do this sometimes with my own sermons in church. You know, I'll work out my text, I'll write out a text, and then do a smog test on it and discover that somebody needs a comprehension age of 21 to get what you're saying. The classic example of this was one of our local primary schools, which had a partnership, a long-standing partnership with an American, and his congregation in the States wanted to give a gift to the school. So they sent over lovely full-colour booklets, printed them specially. Must have cost them a fortune. But unfortunately, when I ran it through the smog test, it required a comprehension age of 17. And this was a gift for P3 and P4. So obviously it missed the mark. But whichever version you find online, have a wee look for the smog test and have a wee go at it and see what's the actual comprehension age of what you're saying. It works with scripture readings too. So here's an example, almost picked at random, 1 Peter chapter 4 in the NIV. If you had a look at that section of scripture, you'll find it's got 46 polysyllabic words. The nearest perfect square to 46 would be 49. So the square root of 49, 7 sevens, add on 3 is 10. If you're not into maths, this might look just weird. But what that means is that the New International Version of that chapter of 1 Peter requires a comprehension age that matches the average P7 S1 pupil. Now, knowing that helps you to choose, say, a memory verse, helps you to think about the length of readings that you use in an event. It helps you think through the questions you ask pupils. So if you read them a big chunk like this, and then ask them questions about it, you've got to bear in mind some of them will be struggling to comprehend what the passage was about, let alone what your question is looking for. It's all about thinking about how we do things. A wee caution to the smog index. It's a useful tool, but it is only a rough guide to reading and comprehension levels. And it does relate to technically what's called weird sampling, which I just love. But weird sampling means that this formula was worked out for Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. So it was road tested in European and North American schools. So typically in a class these days, you will have pupils for whom English is second language, or sometimes even third language. So the comprehension difficulties are multiplied even more. This is all just to say, have a think about what you're actually saying, the words that you actually use. We all use PowerPoint these days, and most schools, you've got that capacity. You can put stuff up on the big screen. So a couple of slides here about best practice with PowerPoint. Again, there's various versions of this, but really they all are a case of the less you put up, the better. So this chap, Guy Kawasaki, he says, for example, he works with the 10-20-30 rule. So if he's doing a presentation and using PowerPoint, maximum 10 slides, maximum 20 minutes speaking, and a maximum size of print, 30-point print, which means on your average PowerPoint screen, you only get about 6 lines, not any more than that. This is keying into the fact that people learn in different ways. So some people are verbal processors. They'll latch onto the words you say. Some are literary, so they'll latch onto the words that you show on screen. Others are visual thinkers, and they'll catch an image, and that will say much more to them than anything else. Now, Guy Kawasaki was talking about presentations within school, within college, and so on. This was his recommendation, 10, 20, 30. I think you could cut each of those in half. It's about you thinking through, how can I be most effective? An overload of PowerPoint is not effective. In fact, these days, I think for some, it's just an active switch off. Another way to put it, and I find this more helpful actually, is the 6x6 rule. So a maximum of 6 lines per slide, a maximum of 6 words per line. I'm just looking at that, wondering, did I get it right on that particular one? Yeah. The 6x6 rule. Let me stop again. I don't want this to be a monologue. Hi, Cara. How was lunch?
Nothing overly exciting, but fine.
Right. How is your dad? Is he comfortable?
He is, yeah, he's comfy, so we're just waiting to find out what's going to happen next.
Okay. We'll keep you in prayer.
Thank you.
Any thoughts then on that second little section that we've gone over? We've looked at the template. I've looked at some guidelines, hints and tips for presentations within school. Anybody want to chip in and add one? What would be your top tip on effective work in schools?
I totally agree. Like, I really like all of that. It's really helpful being able to kind of put that into words, because I guess you're kind of aware of it to an extent. I remember somebody saying to me about PowerPoint and stuff just in general, that like they are like aiding you, that like you're the speaker and you still need to be the main thing. Like you're the human that's speaking to them, and that they're looking at you, and that's just an additional help to you. Like, don't make the PowerPoint the main thing so that you become secondary. I thought it was a helpful thing, because then it's just that actually connecting with a human and you're actually like engaging with them with your face.
Yes, like anything else, it's a tool, and it should aid and not distract.
Yeah.
Some people are very gifted storytellers, and they don't need a picture or a PowerPoint behind them. Just they have that ability to engage adults as well as children. So if that's your gift, hallelujah. Enjoy it, use it. What's the worst example you've ever seen of communication in a school then?
Reading some of the chapter, I'll be honest, I didn't read every bit of the chapter for this week, but I read some of it, and but particularly the video that you shared as well, then just me reflecting on assemblies and stuff I had when I was at school, and you know, I've been in a Christian home all my life, and part of church all my life, and I think I remember it was in 5th or 6th year. So at my stage, I was particularly zealous. I was just kind of like finding my faith, and somebody came in and, do you know, I was falling asleep. And I remember being really annoyed at the minister and going back and like complaining to my dad and being like, what was he doing? Like he's wasting this whole opportunity that he had. Because it was pretty rare as far as I mind. I don't mind having many folk come in secondary. And it's, I can't even remember. He was talking about Jerusalem, modern day Jerusalem, but he just had so many photos and it just meant nothing. And there was so many photos and then loads of text as well that were completely shattered in that row. It was just like a block of text.
Yeah.
You just like stood and read this thing. I was just like, I remember thinking like, what are you doing? It's just not. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I've experienced that too. People who have treated it like a lecture for adults.
Mm.
It's not when you're working with kids. You have to bear in mind a lot of children and young people have really short attention spans. You know, the TV generation need a change every 10, 15 seconds.
My worst example is myself working with another minister. So it was a minister from a different church, and I'd never done anything with him before. And we went into this primary school to do an assembly. And it was probably my first week in the job, so I still wasn't aware of really much that was going on or anything. And it was Jonah and the whale, and he got me to act it out, and he wanted me to act things out while he read the story. And I am no actress whatsoever; like it just doesn't work. But he also wanted me to memorize the script and do it that I wasn't looking at anything. And he'd written down like specific instructions on the actions I had to do at each point in the story, which I obviously then forgot. And he was standing there repeating the same line over and over again, like she's not doing what I'm asking her to do. And I'm like, I can't remember what I'm doing here. And it was just a total mess. So now I'm very, very careful onto who I agree to do anything with. And it's always like planned in advance. I know exactly what we're doing because I'm like, that's never happening again.
Yeah.
Dreadful.
I think I need to add that into my top tips, the idea of practice, practice, practice. Yeah. I go away on 3 residentials a year, 2 of them with Scripture Union, 1 with a school. But the SU ones, I do a lot of storytelling. And I've learned over the years, if you're going to work with somebody else, practice with them first. And even when I'm doing a story myself, I do aim to get to that point where I can do it without a script. That I know the story, I know where it's going, and that way I can engage with eye contact and so on. But I actually spend time before preparing the story. So I'll go over the story 9 or 10 times in my study before I actually do it in an event. So thanks, Cara. That's a useful reminder. Just practice, practice, practice. Where I sit at the moment, my study is straight across the road from my neighbour. My trees have grown a wee bit at the moment, so my neighbour can't actually see in. But I do remember one event where I was pacing about in the study, practicing a story and doing all the actions. And then I just suddenly realised my neighbour was standing at the window watching me. And she was just going. And it was a really nice affirmation because talking to her later, she got the story. But all she could see was me pacing about in the study. So I am more careful now about practicing with the curtains shut. But practice, practice, practice. Yeah. Anybody else? Top tip?
The one that sprung to mind for me was I remember somebody talking about being washed with the blood of Christ, and it was so literal that the children, I'm sure, would have expected that you literally had to wash yourself with blood. There was no explanation of, well, it was full of jargon, and there was no real explanation or application to it. So, you know, I suppose the top tip there would be again and understanding where the audience is at compared to where you're at.
Yeah. That's where the smog test can be really handy as well, because it does pick up on the points where you're using jargon. But yep, that's a classic example of Christians know what you talk about when you talk about being washed in the blood of the Lamb. But as an image, it's absolutely gross. Okay, thanks, folks. Now, I see we're at 5-2. And I think it's a good point just to take a wee 10-minute break. My coffee's gone cold, so I'm going to go have to top up. And if we come back together at 5 past, and I'll pause the recording just now. And I'll bring up our screen share for the next part of our time together. Okay, you're back at the rainy scene there. You can see that one again. Okay. It's a game of two halves, so here's our second half kicking off. Just want to start off by asking a question here for a wee bit open discussion. And thinking through that template and the focus on the sensings, the spiritual element, and so on. Thinking about good practice, bad practice. Here's the question. How do you know when you've provided a time for reflection event and not a values event or a citizenship event or a motivational event? How do you know when you've actually done TfR and not something else? Okay. So that's the question. Anybody want to weigh in on it? I'm looking at a screen full of pensive and thoughtful faces here.
Well, my initial thought is the religious element. You know, if a time for reflection is part of a religious observance, then if it is absent of any faith-based element, then it would be a values-based approach rather than a TfR specifically. That's my instinct.
Very good. Yeah. TfR is short for time for reflection. Up until about 10 years ago, it was just universally called religious observance. So our assemblies came under that title, religious observance. And the RME class, it was religious and moral education. So yeah, that's a good starter. You know, it's a TfR event if it includes something religious. Anybody want to run with that one? Tell us a bit more.
I'm thinking of along the lines of it should maybe leave them wondering a bit more and kind of having more thoughts to have after the event rather than something that they have like definitive answers from. Because I think that would more fall into if you're thinking of like a motivational event or something about values that they really, you know, there's a clear kind of answer to some of that stuff. Whereas maybe time for reflection should have them going away and having further thoughts and wonderings on the subject.
Thank you. Thanks, Cara. Yes, and that is reflected in this change of title. Not calling it religious observance, but calling it time for reflection. So curiously, if an event leaves children and young people with more questions than answers, maybe that's actually an indication you've done a TfR event rather than a citizenship training event or a moral education event. Good.
I was just thinking, Steve, we were talking about time for reflection and letting the pupils go away and having a time for reflection. You know, it was interesting to read in a book. Sometimes people can do assemblies or do talks and they can go off on one and they can forget about their audience, they can forget about the pupils, they can... No, it was just interesting in the book where it was saying that pupils would like to be time for them to reflect, ask questions and just just give them some time and some input rather than just being all about me speaking and me telling them and so on, you know. I just found that very interesting reading it.
Thanks, Craig. I think that is another genuine point of when you're doing a TfR event. You're engaging in a conversation. You're listening as well as talking. And you're giving pupils, I think, a chance to feedback, to respond, to figure out for themselves how it applies to them. Fiona and Ian, how about you? Anything you would add? That's okay. You don't have to.
I would agree with Craig on that time given to kind of think. You know, sometimes it's good to have time to reflect within the time for reflection, you know, to kind of mull over what's been said rather than just, and I've seen it done as well, where it's been just given, and there's no interaction, there's no kind of moments of silence where you can just think. So I get what Greg's saying, absolutely. You just need that time sometimes, and it needs to be given, because as soon as you head out that door, they're back at it again, you know, it's just busy, busy, busy. So if you're having a time for reflection, have time for reflection in the time for reflection.
Yeah. Yes, that ability to build in moments of silence, I think, is something that's quite unique to a time for reflection event. It's brought back memories, you saying that, actually, of an assembly that we did in our local secondary school. And in fact, from memory, it was, I think it was an S5, S6 group. So we had all of them sitting there, and typical of the new build secondary schools these days, everything comes onto the one area. So you've got all the classrooms are in wings off to the side. And you don't these days have a separate assembly hall, gym hall, dining hall. It's all the one space. And typically the design seems to be that come change over time, everybody crosses through that one area. And time is always critical. So we were doing an assembly that was starting at 9 o'clock, finishing at 10 past, because at 10 past the bell goes and all the registration classes empty out through that space. It's a real killer, and it really focuses the mind when you know you've got to get it right to the second. And we did one event where we had the idea of taking advantage of the sound system, and it did work this time, of treating it like a cathedral space. So we did a very brief visual presentation, and then we played a recording of a solo voice with no music, and it just echoed around the hall like a cathedral. And the beauty of it was that was our end piece. We weren't going to explain it. The words themselves in the song spoke. So there was this lovely cathedral atmosphere, an absolute quietness, and this single solo voice. And all these 5th and 6th year pupils and all the teachers standing about just went absolutely quiet. And they held that, I would say, for about 20 seconds. And then the bell went. And I'm thinking, oh no. But the curious thing was, as every class came in, they all sensed the quietness. And every class came in loud, noisy, and then just stopped and tiptoed through the space. And I thought that was TfR. We couldn't have engineered that, couldn't have planned that. But that was, for me, that was definitely TfR, when there was a change in the atmosphere and a real quietness. And it was talked about for the next couple of days. You know, what happened there? We had a moment of silence. Okay, thanks for that, Fiona. That sparked off a very happy memory there. More often than not, you're halfway through a sentence, you haven't reached the critical point, and then the bell goes. And all chaos lets loose. Okay, I think it's important that we do think through this issue. How do we know when we've done time for reflection and not morality or lecture or something else? There's got to be that spiritual element, that spiritual moment. Call it religious if you want, but let's say just go with that for a moment. And I want to introduce to you a name that you might not have come across. Dr. Lisa Miller. She's a professor at Columbia University across in New York. It's one of the Ivy League universities. It's very prestigious, and she is a full professor there. They've got a particular focus at Columbia on research. Now, what's interesting about Lisa Miller is that her professorship is on the science of spirituality. How good is that? We tend to think of the American system as being completely divorced from religion and spirituality. We tend to think of American education being totally secular. But Lisa Miller is a professor of the science of spirituality. And these are her two key books. She's written so many. The first one was called The Spiritual Child. The second one is The Awakened Brain. This is her newest book. Now, Lisa Miller works a lot with Pentagon funding. One of the curiosities of the American system is the focus on the military. And to give them their due, to give them their credit, the American military figured out a long time ago that if you train men and women to kill, to use weapons, then you need to train them to know when to use those weapons. So as well as the technical skills of killing, they need to understand when they should not shoot. They need to have a strong sense of right and wrong. So for over 100 years, the Pentagon has funded research in the universities into character formation. And one of the earliest outcomes of that was a focus on spirituality. So every American military unit has a chaplain attached. And the chaplains are trained militarily. They go alongside the soldiers, the airmen, the sailors, and so on. But they also have a very specific spiritual role. They're there partly to do the moral education, the ethics education, the right and wrong. They're partly there as the conscience of the unit. They're there with a distinct role to question command structures, which is quite astonishing, but they actually have that authority to try and figure out, is this a lawful rule? Is this a lawful command? Is it right that we're being asked to open fire at this particular point? So the military in the US actually has a strong connection of chaplains. We have that also in the British, in the UK military as well. There's a long established pattern of padres, and they're very much respected. It takes different forms. It's interesting within the British Navy. British Army gives its chaplains a specific rank. In the British Navy, a chaplain has the same rank as the person they're speaking to, which is actually really thoughtful and liberating. So if a Navy chaplain is talking to the ratings on deck, he or she shares the same status with them. If they're talking to the captain in the wardroom, they share the same status, and it gives them that freedom to challenge, to question, and to act as the conscience, to be the reminder of ethics and spirituality and religion and so on. If an admiral comes in, a Navy chaplain is automatically equal in rank. That's quite a responsibility. However, I'm digressing slightly. Let's come back to Lisa Miller. And why I want to mention her in particular is her work on the science of spirituality. And I'll give you just a quick summary of some of her findings under that heading, the science of spirituality, and you'll hopefully see the relevance of this in a moment. The first thing that she points out from all her research is that spirituality, and she does use that word deliberately rather than religion, spirituality is an innate human trait. To be human includes certain physical characteristics, certain abilities in thinking and language skills and so on. But to be human also includes an innate spirituality, and that spirituality could be expressed in all kinds of ways, but it's there in every human being. This was the gist of our first book, The Spiritual Child. Spirituality is an innate human trait. You might have heard versions of that for example, the idea that there's a God-shaped hole inside of everybody. There's something in each of us that wonders about things beyond what we can touch, taste, see, feel, and so on. There's that ability, partly of the human ability, to ask questions of purpose and meaning. So we look up at the night sky and we think, how did that get there? Who put that there? Questions of what happens to me after death? Is there more to life than this? These are essential spiritual questions, and Lisa Miller argues very cogently that spirituality is an innate human trait. She then makes the point, quite simply, that spirituality and religion do overlap. I would hope that our religious faith has some spirituality in it. Not always the case, is it? But spirituality and religion definitely overlap. Now, from all her research looking at brain patterns while people are meditating, while they're praying, and so on, she's come up with this rough formula. And I think she makes quite a convincing case in her book, The Awakened Brain. What she suggests is that when we're expressing our spirituality, it usually takes on a religious form. So we express our spirituality with theological language, with practices, for example, of prayer, of worship, meditation. So our spirituality often takes a religious form and shape. Lisa Miller suggests that 1/3 of our expression of spirituality is innate. It's there in us. We all have this desire to connect with a transcendent being, to make sense of the universe around us, to question what lies beyond the things we can sense. So 1/3 of our expression of spirituality is that innate God-seeking. 2/3 of it, she suggests, is actually absorbed from our ethos, the situation we're in, our culture, our school, and our parents. And she reckons that patterns of spirituality are largely fixed by the age of 6 or 7. And it's interesting, for example, you mentioned the point that you were brought up in a Christian home. If you're brought up in a Christian home, you absorb all sorts of stuff, all sorts of practices. And you may not begin to question them until much later. And I think that illustrates Lisa Miller's point. But she also says that any culture that ignores that innate spirituality creates problems for itself. It creates a lack of spiritual literacy. It creates problems with ethics, with a sense of right and wrong, with morality, and so on. So I commend those 2 books to you, particularly The Awakened Brain. It will stretch your brains, certainly. But to keep that in mind as we look at this next section, that spirituality is an innate human trait. There's something in each of us that looks beyond self, that wonders if there's a God or gods, that wonders what happens beyond death, that wonders what there is beyond what we can sense. This is where ghost stories fit in. It's where religion fits in. It's that space for exploring our spirituality. So let's come at our initial question in a slightly different format. Rather than how do you know when you've done time for reflection, how do you know when your time for reflection has been truly successful and spiritual. Have a wee think about that for a moment. How do you know when your event has been successful, deliberately in quotation marks, and spiritual? This is where a sip of caffeine helps.
Steve, I would say you would know it would be successful when, for example, you mentioned last week that when you've done an assembly and stuff, you had parents coming back and saying, I remember I heard you spoke about this and spoke about that. So if a pupil was to go home and end up speaking to his parents and speaking about assembly, it happened 2 weeks ago, you know, it'd be successful then, because he's obviously taking something from it and he's going and sharing it with other people, you know.
Yeah, hopefully it's something positive he's remembered.
Yeah. So it's obviously something that stirred them up to be excited to speak about, you know.
Yeah.
It would be that case.
And yet Ian also described a memory of an assembly for a long time ago that was just incomprehensible. So was that a successful event then? It was remembered. I'm putting you on the spot there, Craig. Is just
Well,
the ability to remember something, is that a sign of success?
depends on the way. You're right, depends on the conversation the person was having, whether it took a positive or a negative from it, you know, but
yeah, I wonder if sometimes they go to the kids go to the parents and say, you'll never guess what Steve did this time.
I mean, I can only think just what some of the others were sharing to your first question, which was maybe a bit of an overlap in your answers, but I think maybe what others are getting at, just if you're actually getting ones genuinely reflecting and going away and thinking about stuff. And if they're chatting about it, or like Craig saying, if they're minding something from a previous time, or they're going to speaking about it to others, then it's got in. They're processing it, and they are they've been challenged about something, to think about something.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're actually right, and you're right too, Craig. When they do remember something, and when they come back, Ian, and question you about it. So when the kids come back the next week and say, "Remember when you said such and such?" and they'll ask a question related to that, you know then that they've been thinking about it, they've been reflecting. Okay, let's carry on, because I want to just use this last half hour then to think a bit about feedback. How do you know when you have been successful? What are the measures that you've actually done something spiritual? Because over the years, I've come across a lot of false ideas about what makes a time for reflection event successful. I've done this sort of training with chaplains for many years now across the country, and sometimes I'll sit and ask them, tell me about a good assembly. How do you know it was good? And I've lost count how many times somebody said, well, I thought it was successful. Perhaps you did. Perhaps that minister that spoke about being washed in the blood of the Lamb thought it was successful. Perhaps that lecture with all the pictures of Jerusalem and the full history, they thought it was successful. I think it was successful. There's an obvious problem with that. It's a totally subjective assessment, isn't it? Another common thing that I get is that somebody says to me, I'll sit down with a chaplain after an event and we'll try and analyse it, and they'll say, well, the head teacher was happy with it, or the senior management team were happy with it. When you dig into that usually what that means is that there were no problems. There was no behavioural disruption. they were happy with it because it kept the pupils quiet for 20 minutes while staff were doing their Macron time. Or it, I think it's one of these subjective things. The head teacher was happy with it. Now, most head teachers are actually very tolerant, and they might be unhappy with what you've done, but they'll be thinking to themselves, well, it's only 10 minutes. We can forget that and move on. They were happy with it. Maybe they were just happy with the behaviour, or that they were able to do their bit, the litter lecture, the uniform lecture. Another common response I get is chaplains who say, well, the pupils clearly enjoyed it and they were engaged with it. And again, you drill down, you ask them, how do you know? What does that mean? Well, it means that you stuck in a joke and they laughed at the right point. It means that they sat quietly and they looked as if they were engaged. You have no idea what the kids were actually thinking. Kids are experts at looking engaged. We all are. You ever sat in a group and you've stifled a yawn? Pupils were engaged with it. Another common thing is, well, there were no complaints. Pupils and staff can be incredibly tolerant, but I just wonder sometimes, what were they saying in the staff room afterwards? What was the analysis going on? What did the pupils say about it? There were no complaints. Another common thing is that a chaplain picks on a certain quantifier. So, for example, my chosen quantifier says it was successful. The example that comes to mind is where the chaplaincy team were talking about the need in the local community, and they were highlighting the local food bank. So they gave a challenge to the pupils to come in next week with some item that they could pass on to the food bank. And this chaplain said it was very successful because we got 3 carrier bags full of stuff handed in the next week. And I have to admit, I kind of punctured a bubble there because I said, that's brilliant. How many pupils are in the school? 1,400 pupils. This was an assembly across all year groups. So I question your quantifier. It was successful because we got 3 bags full of goodies in return. Again, when you get them to just question, whereabouts did that come from? Most of it had come from staff. So that was the quantifier, that was the measurable thing. There was a definite response because we got so many bags of stuff. No. In contrast, I did one event once with Hamilton College. And it was a few years ago now, just when we were starting our local food bank. And Hamilton College is the largest independent Christian school in Scotland. We did a presentation on food bank, and they turned it into a house competition. So the 4 houses had a competition to see who could raise the most. We ended up with 6 tons of food, which was just astonishing. 6 tons, 3 bags. I think we could say that on that point, the school actually got the point of helping the local community and produced 6 tons of material. We had to hire a van to pick it all up. It was brilliant. Okay, now I've highlighted in red the last key point here, and that's how do you know when an event has actually been successful, when it's hit the mark spiritually? And I think this is the most important one, is when pupil feedback says it was. And what I want to do now is just introduce to you about half a dozen different ways to get meaningful pupil feedback. So seatbelts on, crash helmets on, here we go. here's one of the ones that I've used quite a lot, particularly in secondary school. And you can choose to do this in concert with the school staff. You could ask them to pre-select a sample from each year group, or you could just put out one of these to every pupil. However you work it, this is a really simple tool. It's the response quadrant. So it's a blank sheet. You give it out to a selection of pupils or to a whole year group, and they can, in the next week, write a response here. So top left quadrant, this event made me think that. Top right, this event made me feel. Bottom right, this event made me wonder. Bottom left, this event made me want to. That I found is an incredibly useful tool, and you'll get some very thoughtful pupils who will engage with this. It requires a bit of logical thinking, a bit of higher order thinking skills. It requires, I would say, a good level of literacy, of self-expression and confidence, but it's a good exercise. And if you stress to pupils, it's anonymous as well. They don't need to put their name on this. But it's really helpful, some of the answers you'll get back. And it touches on more than just factual remembering. It's about, what did this make them think about? What did it make them wonder or feel? What did it make them want to do? That's one that works really well with secondary school. Special needs, younger children, then a good thing to use is the emotion and behavior fans, and there are dozens of different ones that you can get. This works really well with special needs children, and sometimes it's better if you're working along with a classroom auxiliary or with the helper who's always with a particular child. And the kids are used to using these. You'll quite often see some of the auxiliaries going about, and they've got a whole batch of these stuck on their waist. But it's about emotions and feelings and so on. You can buy commercial sets. You could make your own reset. Typically, the commercial sets cost about £10. But you can see it's a range of possible responses. So for kids who are non-verbal or who use signs and Makaton and so on, this is a good way to get a reaction from them. So that bottom one is the emotions fan, and it's got symbols for emotional reactions. How did you feel about the assembly? Happy, sad, angry. It's a discussion starter, so it really helps kids to think through what they felt. This is a primary school standard with 2 stars and a wish. There's lots of commercially available ones. You get stickers, stamps, bookmarks, templates to go with it. But it's a standard format in primary school for marking all sorts of work that pupils hand in. So you set your pupils a homework assignment, they produce something, and a teacher will go, that's good, I would give you a star for this, a star for that. I wish you had thought about such and such. Now, it's quite interesting if you turn the tables and hand this form to the pupils to assess you. So, again, this is one that works well in primary school because they're familiar with being on the receiving end of this, and they love the responsibility of putting you on the spot. So again, just ask the school, would they mind picking out 2 or 3 pupils in each year group that would complete this form for you? So they love the responsibility. They'll sit there with their pen and their paper and they'll watch you do your assembly. And then they'll give you stars for this and a wish for that. And I like the format, stars and a wish, rather than this was good, this was bad. This was right, this was wrong. Here's another one using very simplified emojis. Again, loads commercially available, but it's so easy to make and print your own. And just to get kids to just put a mark. or a sentence or a comment. I really liked that. I didn't get that. I wasn't comfortable with that. Now, that middle one can be very interesting because you might think you've clearly presented an idea or a Bible story, for example, but maybe the kids will go, I didn't get that. What does that mean? What does it mean to be washed in the blood? To give the pupils the opportunity to say, I didn't understand that. That can be really helpful. Another version of that is simplified traffic lights. It's really a question of which of these works for the kids that you work with. So you can use well, that was bad, that was good, not sure about that. And again, it's a discussion starter. So if all the kids say, that was really bad when you did X, Y, Z, you know there's something to explore further there. There's a whole range of emojis that you can use. And I suppose it depends on how comfortable you are with using emojis. And they do shift in meaning, so be careful that what you think you're taking from an emoji is what a pupil actually means by it. So a whole range of feedback that they can give. It can be interesting suggesting this in schools and seeing how teachers react to it. But giving pupils, for example, the opportunity to send a text, an emoji text, can be very interesting. SurveyMonkey. I've used this quite a few times. We've used this when we've been doing rights respecting work in secondary schools. We did one project looking at a life paths project, and we did a SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is a really useful tool if you've used it at all. There is a free format that you can do, which gets you up to 50 responses. If you go for the paid package, then numbers become unlimited and you get some really good statistical analysis tools as well. In one school, our chaplaincy team did this. We did a rights respecting award thing, and we worked out with the staff that as pupils went through each workshop, they could respond in an IT class. They had half an hour to respond in the IT class using SurveyMonkey. Now, when we first set this up, the teachers were a bit worried. They said, you'll get all sorts of abuse. We didn't get any abuse. We got some really useful feedback. SurveyMonkey will guide you through setting up meaningful questions so you get meaningful feedback. But it's a really good tool. And it's ideal because it reinforces learning. It can be done in an IT class, so it's a great example that teachers can use there. This is a picture from a Life Paths event that we did on the life of David Livingstone. David Livingstone, if you know, had a great focus on ending slavery in Africa. And there are some wonderful accounts of him liberating slaves, setting them free from their chains, quite literally. So on that particular event, we created a paper chain of what had the pupils discovered as they learned about Livingstone. What did they want to tell people about what they'd learned? And they wrote that down on these little bands, and we made a paper chain. Just that thinking things through, really useful feedback. The classic post-it notes. I'm sure I've mentioned before that we once did this with a whole school, and it was on the, if you could ask God one question, what would you ask? And we got loads of responses. We did one, I don't know which school was that? We took part in a World of Work, a day for 6 years in one school. And it was about the world of work. It was about the world of education, further education, the world of mental health and so on. We did one on the world of faith. And nobody opted for that one. But they had to do 4 out of 6 in the course of a day. So by rotation, We had about 80 six-year pupils came through this world of faith. And we simply said, if you could ask God one question, what would it be? And we got these responses up on the board. And then we simply asked the class, which one do you want to try and answer right now? And suddenly they were all engaged. It worked really well. Something as simple as a whole board full of post-it notes. Mind maps. Some pupils are familiar with this format. They'll use that. It's quite often used as a way to begin an essay or an assignment. They can jot down ideas, see connections between them. If you work in a school that uses that model, try it with assemblies. Ask them to complete a mind map. What did they think about? What was the image that came to mind? And they can start connecting things. Feedback and assessment through speech bubbles, thought bubbles, mind's eye bubbles. So get them to go through after the event and write down what was in my head when I was thinking about this. What did I see in my mind? What did I want to say? What did I want to ask? Good old talk and draw. Get kids to draw a picture. This was a primary 5 pupil, and his challenge was to draw a picture of God. So now you know what God looks like. Looks like a toilet roll tube with a face stuck on it, sitting on a cloud. But that was really useful. Got them that particular class talking about God and their ideas of God and where they got their ideas of God, what they thought God would be like, and what would God think of them. And they all got to choose a pseudonym. So this particular boy chose Internet Addict. That was his pseudonym. Then there's the more sophisticated things. You can get children to do an interview, get young people to do an interview. You can do something as simple as get a square of cardboard and cut a TV shape out of it. Or you can actually get a little video recorder, make somebody the reporter, make somebody retell a Bible story, for example, and then have somebody interview them. That whole idea of the live report really gets kids engaging with a story and thinking about it. So that's a whole lot of ideas. Let me just stop the screen share. They're all around this issue of how do you know when you've done something spiritual, something that genuinely gets kids reflecting. We've got about 10 minutes left. So let's just open up again and see what your questions and comments and observations are at this point.
I thought that was helpful. I've been, ones I've done before, I've tried to get feedback at the very end of the class just through something similar to your first one in a way, like when working with teenagers, like what, I can't remember the questions, but what did you learn? A kind of idea, what did this make you think? But I've always found it a bit of a pressure to finish on time because ultimately, as you say, if the bell goes, then they're off, they're not putting the time to think about it. So just it's made me think that actually there's other ways of getting feedback beyond the lesson or beyond the session. You don't have to get that there and then, and you can focus on what you're doing. And then maybe if people prepped beforehand, there's a few things there that I took that would be helpful to use. So thanks for that.
That's good, yeah. And I think that's interesting, Lee, that you mentioned that idea of timing. And this is about where the intentionality comes in. The intentionality, for example, of using the template is at the end of the template, it has a bit to say, how are you going to get your feedback? And once you've got that on the template, you begin to adjust your timing. So rather than finding you've reached the end of the class and they're all scattering, work out your timing so that you've got the 5 minutes to get the feedback. It's always much more helpful if you can get instantaneous feedback there and then. I think sometimes if you say, bring this back next week, you'll get 1 out of 100.
It's something as a class teacher I always used to do, because feedback is something that, you know, you have to have in the books as evidence. So we'd always plan it in, we'd always plan in time, whether it be we'd pause partway through and say, right, have a look at the feedback questions. You know, how can you feed back to this? Or whether we'd stop 5 minutes before the end of the lesson and go, now it's time to feedback. So we're stopping the lesson now. Let's have a look at the feedback. So we'd always plan it in, because again, as soon as they get up and leave, that's their thinking time for that session done. So having them come back to it at a later date doesn't give you necessarily accurate feedback.
Mm. Thanks for that, Fiona. I think that highlights for me something that I want everybody else to get as well, is that if we are in schools, I think we need to reach the same professional standards as would be expected of the teachers. Hence using a template, hence thinking about how we get feedback and how we react to it. There are too many chaplains that really seem to treat school as a bit like hit and run. You go in, you do the God slot, and you're out again. And you have no idea what chaos you may have caused or what issues you've left behind. So I think this is about us being better at what we do and honouring the teaching by reaching the same professional standards. Anybody else? Any thoughts and comments? Can I come back to you, Fiona, for a moment? What would be your top tip in terms of getting feedback from pupils? What tool would you use?
I, funnily enough, would look at the 2 stars and a wish, because it's something that I've used. I was primary school, and it was the one that was used within the school. And I think it'd be great to flip it to get the feedback from students. And give them the opportunity to give you the feedback. We've done it once or twice before in like an observation situation where we've had people come in to observe the class, and I always preempted the class and go, we're going to have some visitors in today, and they're coming to observe what we're doing. But actually on that, I'd like your feedback. So on the board would give 2 stars and a wish and give them as a table an opportunity to come back. But I do like the post-it notes as well, but you can get a bit overwhelmed with lots of post-it notes.
Yeah. When you have a couple of hundred to go through, it does take time. And you'll get the same comment again and again, but that's good to hear. And you'll also get the genuine insight that you thought, I'd never thought of that. Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that, Fiona. Has anybody else got a feedback method that they've used that we didn't mention there, didn't cover? Okay, folks. We've reached that glassy-eyed stage. My gift to you today, let's finish 5 minutes early. How would that be? That gets double thumbs up. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.